have a look at this cute, sweet little baby. Don't you just want to cuddle him? He's so innocent. He's so adorable. He could grow up to be anything. And here's another adorable little baby in his little baby dress. Yeah, he's a guy, but his mommy put him in a dress. Doesn't he look so cute? And here's a couple of nice young schoolboys looking towards their future. And two more schoolboys. And here we have a little boy cuddling with his little dog. And here on the left, we have an adorable, beautiful family. And on the right, we have a little boy looking kind of lost and worried. Don't you just want to pull him aside and reassure him and tell him, you don't have to look so lost and worried. Everything's going to be okay. Yeah, the cute little kids I just showed you pictures of were the Nazi elite. Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels, Hess, Baldur von Schirach, Albert Speer, Goering. These are the top Nazis who committed the most notorious crimes in history. The Nazis are responsible for the murder of millions of completely innocent civilians. People who did nothing to deserve being killed. Here's a webpage from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. 6 million Jews. These were German people's friends and neighbors, school teachers, shopkeepers, the kid next door, rounded up, sent to concentration camps, and murdered. 7 million Soviet citizens. That would be the Soviet Union, Russia. 3 million Soviet prisoners of war. A couple million Polish people. Those are my relatives, my family members. Serbs. People with disabilities, the first group that the Nazis mass murdered as part of an organized program, and the last group that the Nazis mass murdered as part of an organized program were handicapped people. Someone who stuttered, someone who was deaf, someone who was blind, someone who walked with a limp, killed, murdered, even though they were German. People we call gypsies or Roma, mass murdered. Jehovah's Witnesses, mass murdered. For what? And it's not just the civilians that the Nazis mass murdered. It's also the soldiers who had to fight in that stupid, miserable war. Tens of millions of human beings, including Americans, lost their lives because of Nazi ideology. And the question becomes, how could this happen? The Nazis mass murdered civilians significantly in 3 ways. One way was the Einsatzgruppen. They would go to villages and round up their enemies, Jews, educated people, handicapped people, Catholic priests, line them up and shoot them. And here you see a Nazi, a young man probably in his 20s, point blank range, murdering a mother and her child. That's the Einsatzgruppen. They killed by shooting. Another method that the Nazis used to murder people, and this was primarily used to murder Jews, although some other groups died this way too, was the gas chambers. Funnel a bunch of people into a room, tell them that they're going to take a shower, and instead of water coming out of the shower head, it would be a poison gas, Zyklon B. And then they would use prisoners to take the bodies of those killed in the gas chambers and burn those bodies in crematoria. And another way that the Nazis would murder people would be just simply to starve them to death. And these are Soviet prisoners of war. How could this happen? Germany was civilized, advanced, well educated. It was a democracy where people could vote for their leaders. And it became, within a very short period of time, hell on earth. How could this happen? Germany was so civilized. It's one of the top countries producing Nobel Prize winners. Some of the world's greatest musicians, artists, poets, novelists are German and have been German for centuries. When people attempt to explain how Nazism could happen in a civilized country, they look back to World War I. World War I was a big, stupid war. It took place in the teens. That's about 20 years before World War II started. And it was a conflict between European powers, Germans, French, Russians, English, Yugoslavs. And a lot of the fighting was this trench warfare where men would dig tunnels in the ground and they would stand in these tunnels and they would shoot men on the other side. This is trench warfare. And it was so incredibly pointless and destructive. They would gain maybe a few feet of territory per battle, and the loss of life was huge. And here's an illustration showing how trench warfare worked. And these are the casualties. And as you can see, Germany lost millions of men. In terms of percentage of the population, Germany suffered greatly. It lost a relatively large percent of its population, men either dying in battle or becoming casualties. That is, they're crippled, they're wounded, they're psychologically damaged. So World War I, and these numbers are from 1914 to 1918, it killed a lot of Germans. After the war ended, it ended with something called the Treaty of Versailles. And Versailles is spelled Versailles, and it's pronounced Versailles. In the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had to admit guilt for the war. And Germans didn't feel that they were particularly guilty for World War I. But the Versailles Treaty demanded that they accept guilt. And the German people resented that because they said, what about all these other countries that fought and that killed our soldiers? Didn't they have some responsibility? So the Germans are resentful. The Versailles Treaty took away German territory. So Germany used to be a relatively big empire. And after World War I ended in 1918, it was a smaller country. And the Germans were very angry about that. Like, they had to give up land. And they had to give up land to Poland. And the Germans were used to looking down on Poland. And so the Germans were very resentful about that. The Versailles Treaty also demanded that the Germans give up their military, no more navy, no more air force, and the Germans were angry about that. Germany also had to surrender territorial integrity. That meant that other countries could just move right into Germany. The military of other countries could enter Germany and, be powerful over the German people, and the German people were very resentful about that. The Germans had to pay war reparations. They had to pay money to the other countries in World War I. So all these conditions after the end of World War I really made the German people angry and resentful. And this cartoon is from that era, and it shows the Germans basically being crushed by the payments that they have to make to the other countries to make up for their allegedly starting World War I. And Germans at this time are really poor. This is the Depression. Remember, the Depression happened in the 1930s, and German money became relatively worthless. And here you have a picture of a man kind of sweeping German money out of the street, and a picture of a woman burning German money in her stove. I mean, just imagine if inflation rendered every dollar bill in your wallet and in your bank account completely worthless. Imagine how upset you would feel. Imagine how frightened you would feel. That's how upset and frightened the German people felt after World War I. And here's a map showing you the loss of territory. Germany used to be a big empire. The ruler of Germany was called Kaiser, which means Caesar in German. And then it became a smaller country because they surrendered all this land to other countries, including Poland, which the Germans thought, well, Polish people are really low class and we're supposed to be higher than them. And we're losing our territory to these miserable Polacks. We don't like that. And the Germans really didn't like having to admit guilt that they were responsible for World War I. And another problem, as you can see in the lower right, that's the Wikipedia page for the German Empire. Germany used to be an empire. Empire means many nations joined together under one monarch. Monarch means ruler. And the monarch of Germany was the Kaiser, which means Caesar. So they used to have this monarchy and they used to have an empire. And all of a sudden, after World War I, they had a democracy where everyone could vote. And we tend to think of democracy as a very positive thing. But not everybody wants to be self-governing. Many people feel more comfortable under a form of government where there's one strong man at the top. And we could see this in Iraq. We invaded the nation of Iraq under Saddam Hussein, saying that we were going to bring in democracy. And maybe the people in Iraq, many people in Iraq, didn't want democracy. They preferred a strongman ruler. And so the Germans had been ruled by a monarch, by a Kaiser, and after the war they had something called the Weimar Republic, which was a democracy, which many Germans frankly didn't like. And this is an article online explaining why the Weimar Republic was not popular with many Germans. Many Germans wanted a strong man ruler at the top. And some scholars believe that the Weimar Republic was just too liberal, that the Germans were kind of old-fashioned and they weren't ready for this liberalism, and so the Weimar Republic may have failed because it was just too liberal for many Germans, and so there was a backlash. Another problem that the Germans were worried about was Soviet Russia. Russia is to the east of Germany, and there had been a big communist revolution in Russia, and there was war in Russia and fighting in Russia, and the communists were murdering people, and the Germans were right next door to this, and they were scared. And they were looking for a strong man to reassure them and say, I am going to protect you from the big bad communists. And so this kind of prepared the way for Hitler. All of these things that happened in German history in the early part of the 20th century, World War I, the mass death, the Versailles Treaty, the Soviet Revolution, is kind of like the preparing the way for Hitler. And some scholars would call this, as you can see in the lower right-hand corner, the perfect storm. There were all these historical factors that came together at once that took a civilized country, Germany, and turned it into hell on earth. And one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves, that people constantly ask, is could this happen again? Could it happen again that a country, a powerful country, feels humiliated and frightened and insecure, and the people start looking for a strong man? So, as I previously mentioned, the Treaty of Versailles left the Germans feeling angry and wanting revenge. Now, here's a problem. Most Germans are Christian. And Christianity, in its teaching, not always in the behavior of Christians, but in the core teachings of Christianity, Christianity counsels against revenge. Christianity teaches love. And again, I'm not saying that all Christians are loving. We know that there are many Christians who are not loving, but Christianity teaches love. And what are you going to do? Germany is a mostly Christian country, and it's teaching love, and it's saying that you can't get revenge. So the Nazis, who in the early 20th century are just a small group of people who are preparing to take over Germany, one of their goals is to get rid of Christianity. So if they get rid of Christianity, what are they going to replace it with? If they close the churches and they tell people not to go to church, and if they tell people not to pray German prayers, what are they going to replace all that with? And here's a quote from the Bible that says, "Don't seek revenge." And the Nazis didn't like that. And here's a story from the Bible, the story of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan teaches something called universal morality. What does universal morality mean? It means that everybody on planet Earth, every human being on planet Earth is equal, and we should all be nice to each other, and we should all take care of each other. And the reason this story is called the Good Samaritan is because Jesus told this story, and back in his day, the Samaritans were looked down upon. They were like a minority group that was discriminated against. And so Jesus purposely talked about Samaritans because they were the people that nobody liked. And Jesus was trying to say, look, the Samaritans are the same as everybody else. We're all the same. Doesn't matter what your nationality is. Doesn't matter what your religion is. Everybody has to be nice to everybody else. And the Nazis did not like universal morality, and they had to replace it with something. So what did they replace it with? They replaced it with something called relative morality. And here you can see this famous quote from Hitler. Hitler said that conscience is a Jewish invention, meaning that if you think about things like good and bad and like, oh, I shouldn't do this because if I do this, I'm committing a sin. I'm going against the 10 Commandments. I shouldn't steal. I shouldn't hate. I shouldn't beat people up. Hitler's saying, let's get rid of that conscience business and make German people strong and ready to go into war and fight and kill without any kind of conscience. So we're going to get rid of the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Bible, all that stuff. What are we going to replace it with? We're going to replace it with something called moral relativism. And this is a Nazi poster, and the message on this Nazi poster is Ein Volk, a people. And Volk is a big word for the Nazis. It means people. A people helps itself. You worry about your own. Don't talk to me about these people in other countries. I don't care about these people in other countries. They're not human. They're not important to me. The only thing that's important to me is my people, my group, German people. I don't want to hear about Russians and Poles and Jews. Forget them. The only time that morality matters is when I'm thinking about my own ethnic group, Germans. And you may be wondering, well, where did they get this idea? Where did it come from? And how did they support this idea? Remember, nature abhors a vacuum, and nature is always going to come in and fill that vacuum with something else. So once you get rid of Christianity and the Bible and all that stuff, and you get rid of the idea of universal morality, how are you going to fill the gap that's left? And here's a picture of Himmler. Himmler was a really big Nazi leader. He was very close to Hitler. He was very powerful. And here he is with his little daughter Gudrun. And Gudrun remained a Nazi until her death. I think she died in 2018. I could be wrong. And you can see he's very kind and loving. Himmler is very kind and loving with his daughter Gudrun because she is his daughter. So she's important and she has value. And here's that same guy Himmler looking at concentration camp inmates, one of whom is apparently starving to death. Himmler doesn't care about these people because they're not German. If you're not German, you don't matter. So where did Himmler get these ideas, and how did Himmler support these ideas? Himmler gave a lot of speeches where he talked about Nazi morality, and they're his Poznan speeches. Polish name Poznan, German name Posen, but he was in a city called Poznan or Posen where he gave these speeches. And basically what he would say, and you could see on the screen there, he says that Christianity is a plague because Christianity makes us weak. If you're thinking about being nice to other people, then you're weak. You're a loser. You are not a good Nazi. You should only think about people from your own ethnic group. You think about Germans. Germans are the people who matter. Russians are garbage, and Jews are garbage. They are garbage. You can kill them, and there's no moral price to be paid for murdering a Russian or a Jew or a Pole, because the only people who matter are Germans. So this is the new morality, and how are they supporting this new morality? The Nazis basically were nuts. They were crazy. And they had this weird, sick, perverted fantasy about the past. They believed that before Christianity came along, we were all pagans, and we were violent, and we could kill anybody, and we could go into the war, and we could murder people, and it was a really good time. And I'm not saying that this is what paganism really was, because again, the Nazis were crazy and evil. But this was the crazy, evil Nazi vision of the pagan past. The idea that before Christianity came along and made everybody weak and kind of, girly and, limp, the pagans were these big, muscular warriors who could kill without thinking and never felt any pain, etc., etc. So this is basically the new Nazi religion. They're taking their fantasy of ancient pre-Christian paganism and they're making it their new religion. And like Thor, the Nazis really liked Thor, and one of Himmler's religious advisors called himself Wise Thor. And they're really into the Vikings because the Vikings could go berserk and could go into battle and kill without any kind of conscience. And there's a fascinating movie made by Leni Riefenstahl, who was one of Hitler's filmmakers. She was actually his favorite filmmaker. You probably learned in school that the Olympics were held in Berlin in 1936. That's where Jesse Owens was an African-American runner, and he was able to do really well in the Olympics, even though, the Nazis were opposed to him because he was a black man. Leni Riefenstahl made this movie called Olympia about the Berlin Olympics. And she begins her movie with the scene that you see in the background. That is a Greek pagan temple. And Leni Riefenstahl begins the movie with scenes of Greek pagan temples and gods and statues. And then all those gods and statues come to life as modern day Germans. And what Leni Riefenstahl is saying with that movie Olympia is, in the past, the Greek pagans were powerful warriors and they were defeated by Christianity, but we're going to go back to the past and we're going to be like the ancient Greek gods and warriors, we modern day Germans. And believe me, the ancient Greeks would have despised the Nazis. I think if Aristotle had lived to see the Nazis, he would have spat upon them. So again, this is not really what the ancient Greeks were like. This was like a Nazi fantasy of ancient Greece. And this is a still image from the movie Olympia. And as you can see, it's an actual living German person made up to look as if he were a Greek god. And this is the Nazis saying, our new religion is the ancient religion of paganism. And here's Leni Riefenstahl on the right and Hitler to the left. And Leni Riefenstahl was a brilliant filmmaker and her movies are beautiful. And you can watch Olympia on YouTube and I recommend it. It's a great movie, but she was a Nazi. So she was an evil person who made great movies. Now, the Nazis didn't come up with this themselves. The Nazis did not invent this idea of going back to the past to kind of grab onto these ancient pagans who are all about war, etc. The Nazis went back to the 19th century, that would be the 1800s, and they picked some themes from German culture in the 1800s. And here is Richard Wagner, who is a opera composer and musician, and his music is like beautiful. He writes beautiful music, but he was a very bad man and he really didn't like Jews, and he made these operas that kind of dramatized German gods and heroes and warriors. And please remember that Wagner died in 1883. And the Nazis came to power in the early 1930s, which is decades after Wagner died. So I'm not telling you that Wagner was a Nazi. Wagner died before the Nazis came to power. But he was one of the streams, one of the influences that the Nazis picked up on. So I'm not telling you that Wagner was a Nazi. He wasn't. He died before the Nazis came to power. But given that Wagner wrote all these operas that depicted German pagan gods and heroes, the Nazis were really into that. And here's a scene from one of Wagner's operas, and you can see it. He's depicting these German women as Valkyrie, as these kind of mythological creatures who go collect the dead bodies of the warriors after the battle is over. And the Ride of the Valkyrie is one of the most famous pieces of classical music. And if you've never heard it, you should really hear it. Google Ride of the Valkyrie. Valkyrie is spelled V-A-L-K-Y-R-I-E. And you've got to hear it. It's a great piece of music. And here's another scene from a Wagner opera, and as you can see, everybody's got their spear, everybody's looking very serious, and you know, the Nazis just love this stuff. And here's another scene from a Wagner opera. And here's Wagner on the left and Hitler on the right. Hitler loved Wagner. He used to attend Wagner's operas and he would see all these German gods and heroes fighting battles and going to Valhalla. And it was just so inspirational for him because he was into war and killing and glorification of German nationality. And here's another guy who influenced the Nazis and who lived in the early 1800s. He was actually born in the 1700s. This guy's name is Herder, and Herder celebrated the connection of a person to his homeland. And this is called nationalism, where you think that your home is a really special place and your connection to your homeland is almost like spiritual and magical. Nature brings forth families. The most natural state, therefore, is also one people with a national character all its own. Everyone loves his country, his manners, his language, his wife, his children, not because they are the best in the world, but because they are absolutely his own, and he loves himself and he loves his own laborers. Here he is again, Johann Gottfried Herder. He saw every cultural group as unique. Herder was not a Nazi. See, he died in 1803. This is like more than 100 years before the Nazis came to power. But he celebrated the connection between a person and his nation. And the Nazis were really big on that. And more about Herder. Herder kind of saw your connection to your homeland as like an umbilical cord. And your homeland is like your mother. And she's feeding you and she's supporting you. And so you should love whatever you call home more than you love any place else. So I come from New Jersey, so I should love New Jersey and never leave New Jersey and eat New Jersey pizza, and I should talk with a New Jersey accent, and I should love the New Jersey Turnpike and I should only listen to Bruce Springsteen. Herder thought that all of that stuff was magic, and that if you go live any place else and if you eat any other kind of food and you listen to any other kind of music, you're failing because you're supposed to be really connected to your homeland. So Herder is another inspiration and influence for the Nazis. And believe it or not, another inspiration for the Nazis are the Brothers Grimm. The Brothers Grimm were really into German stuff, and so they collected these German fairy tales, and it's called Grimm's Fairy Tales, and this is the German cover. Kinder- und Hausmärchen means child and household tales. Kinder means child, und means and, Haus means house, Märchen means more or less fairy tale. We would translate it as fairy tale. So this is their book, and it's German fairy tales for German children with German lessons. So they're emphasizing the whole German nature of these fairy tales. And here's another cover of Kinder- und Hausmärchen. And there are the Brothers Grimm in the corner there. And the Nazis loved this stuff. They ate it right up because they were like, oh, these are German fairy tales about German vampires and German werewolves. And the Nazis were really into vampires and werewolves. And it sounds crazy because you think that, these are serious people, starting wars and mass murdering people. But one of the things that inspired them was their crazy wacko belief in werewolves and fairy tales and witches. Yes, the Nazis believed in witches. And I'm not saying everybody in Germany. I'm talking about the top Nazis. The guys at the top who are leading the party are into werewolves and vampires and witches. And as a matter of fact, Himmler, who is the leader of the SS, one of the most important Nazis, devoted a great deal of energy to studying witches because he thought that witches were going to be the saviors of Germany. And here you see a Nazi poster that has a Viking ship in the background. And basically what this poster is saying is that you're a German, you're going to be just like your German ancestors, just like the Vikings, and you're going to be a warrior and you're going to be immortal, and even if you die in battle, that doesn't make any difference because you're going to come back to life as the next German warrior. And I'm not saying that's what the text says, I'm saying that that's the whole idea behind the picture. And here's another picture of Nazis pretending that they are part of a continuous tradition of Nazi warriors going back to pagan times, and that's why they picked the swastika, because the swastika is a pagan symbol. The swastika is found all over the world, and these swastika images that I'm about to show you are from all over the world. The swastika is found in India, it's found in Tibet, it's found in Native American cultures, it's found all over. Why did the Nazis adopt it? Because it was a pagan symbol and because the Nazis wanted to get rid of Christianity, and so they wanted a new symbol. And like I said before, because they're nuts. And, all of these people who use these swastikas would completely be horrified to realize that their sacred symbol has been co-opted by the Nazis to promote Nazism. And here's a Nazi symbol on a Buddhist temple, or excuse me, a swastika on a Buddhist temple. And here's a swastika on an ancient coin. And here's a swastika on a Hindu temple. And here are some more swastikas from the ancient world and a swastika from a Russian embroidery. And the swastika, it is said by anthropologists, represents the path of the sun in the sky. It's a solar symbol. So then a lot of the Nazis were really into sun worshipped. That is worshiping the sun, the sun in the sky. And the swastika represents the path of the sun in the sky. As the sun, it was believed by ancient people, rotates around the earth, because they didn't know that it's actually the earth that rotates around the sun. They thought the sun rotated around the earth. That represents eternity, because every day the sun rises and the sun sets, and the sun rises and the sun sets. So the swastika is meant to be the path of the sun in the sky, rotating around the center of the swastika, which is the earth. And here's another ancient swastika. So on the left here, you see what's called a monstrance. And in the Roman Catholic Church, the Eucharist, that is the body of Jesus Christ, is put in the center of the monstrance, and it's worshipped because it's Jesus and it's his body. And on the right, you see some Nazi women and men marching under a swastika in the center of the monstrance. So the whole idea here is we're going to replace Christianity with ancient paganism, meaning the symbol, the swastika. And again, I'll repeat that the Nazis were nuts and they were evil. So their idea of paganism is completely distorted and crazy. They really didn't understand pagan religions. They were crazy. And the Nazis took a lot of drugs. And there's a good book on that called Blitzed. So this isn't really a rational approach to paganism. And another thing I want to mention is that these are the top Nazis I'm talking about. I'm not talking about German people walking around on the street. German people walking around on the street were probably still Christian, Protestant, or Catholic. But the top Nazis were, again, kind of this crazy, perverted notion of paganism. So this desire to co-opt Christianity and replace it with Nazism went so far as the Nazi concept of Christmas. These are Christmas tree decorations with swastikas on them. And here's a booklet that was given out by the Nazis, and you can see this is 1943. The Nazis at this point are very close to losing the war. The war ends in 1945, so they only have 2 more years of power left. And they're using those 2 years of power to encourage their citizens to celebrate Nazi pagan, quote, winter solstice, whatever, rather than Christmas. And here's a picture of Hitler underneath a Nazi winter solstice tree decorated with Nazi decorations. And up in the left-hand corner, you can see the lyrics that they rewrote for Silent Night. Silent Night is a Christian Christmas carol, and the Nazi lyrics are, "Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright, only the Chancellor," that's Hitler, "stays on guard, Germany's future to watch and to ward, guarding our nation aright. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. Adolf Hitler is Germany's star, showing greatness and glory afar, bringing us Germans the might." And if that doesn't give you creepy chills, I don't know what would. Another thing that the Nazis were into was something called runes. And a lot of this so-called paganism stuff was basically invented. As I mentioned, Himmler had an advisor who called himself Wise Thor, and he would just invent stuff out of whole cloth, like invent ancient pagan traditions. And so runes, R-U-N-E, were a true ancient divinatory device, a way to tell the future. And the Nazis picked up these ancient ruins and they used them for SS ceremonies. So you see some SS rings and some SS ceremonies, like there were Nazi versions of wedding ceremonies, Nazi versions of baptisms, Nazi versions of funerals, all using these runes, which the Nazis claimed were like an ancient magic system. And you can see the runes there, what they supposedly mean. Like one of the runes supposedly means death, and one of the runes supposedly means eternity. And the Nazis used these symbols in their Nazi ceremonies. Nazis did a lot of nutty things because of their nutty beliefs. Possibly one of the nuttiest things that they did was an attempt to train dogs to talk and to train dogs to read, spell, and win World War II. And you hear about this and it's comical. You want to laugh. And you think about the horror. I mean, at the same time that these Nazis are mass murdering millions of innocent people in concentration camps, they're engaging in this bizarre behavior. And this is all part of the nature worship that was a big part of their concept of paganism, that nature is holy and nature is sacred. And the Nazis were actually really kind, well, at least in their laws. They were very kind to animals, like they didn't allow animal experimentation, and Hitler himself allegedly was a vegetarian, and Himmler is also said to have been a vegetarian. Believe it or not, this whole Nazi pagan thing included yoga. The Nazis were big on yoga. And again, I'm not talking about the average German walking around the street. I'm talking about the top Nazis. And on the left, you see a couple of yoga pictures, how we normally think of yoga. You know, some nice American woman meditating by the ocean, or an Indian man meditating. And here on the right, you see a book about the Nazi version of yoga. And basically what the Nazis thought was that they were going to practice yoga and they were going to achieve superpowers. This is all so weird, but this man is one of the weirdest aspects of all. This man was actually Jewish, and he knew Hitler personally, and he performed seances, you know, talking to the dead. And he gave Hitler pointers in how to hypnotize the crowd through speech patterns, through rhyming, through hysterical gestures in his speeches. Sorry, I misspelled the word gestures. Eek. He was a Jewish guy who went under a German name, and he was eventually murdered by the SA. And also he predicted the Reichstag fire. And the Reichstag fire was an event that helped Hitler to gain power. The Nazis were also big on astrology, you know, figuring your fate from the stars. And the Nazis were also big on dowsing, and dowsing is a method to find things. You can find water, you can find healthy places to live, you can find unhealthy places to live by holding a stick that is in the shape of a letter V. And there's no science to this at all. It's just completely nuts. But the Nazis were big on this. And believe it or not, the Nazis tried to find enemy military ships, tanks, etc. through dowsing. And the Nazis were big on reincarnation, the belief that after you die, you come back to life as another person. And Himmler was convinced that he was the reincarnation of a German king from way back. Is this relationship between Nazism and paganism, is this something purely of the past? Well, not 100%. There are still people who cling to these Nazi ideas who are pagans in the United States today. And this is a pretty good article that appeared April 2nd, 2018 in Vice. about neo-Nazis who are, again, pagans and would like to take over the pagan movement. And this article mentions a guy named Augustus Sol Invictus, which means the glorious unconquerable sun, S-U-N, sun, who wants to establish a Nazi pagan state in the United States. And a little bit more from this article. So the thing we have to remember here is that correlation does not equal causation. Yes, the Nazis were fascinated with paganism. They were fascinated with reincarnation, with witches, with werewolves, with vampires, with astrology, with tarot reading, with seances, with psychokinesis, with dowsing, with other religions. They were fascinated with Hinduism and Shintoism and Buddhism and Islam. And as a matter of fact, various people compared Hitler to Buddha and to Muhammad, which is crazy. Just because the Nazis were interested in paganism and magic does not mean that if you are a pagan or if you are a magician or if you are a tarot card reader that you are a Nazi. I myself read tarot cards, but I'm not a Nazi. So remember that correlation does not equal causation. And here's a famous meme from the internet: Hitler drank water. That doesn't mean that everybody who drinks water is Hitler. And most pagans today are really nice, cuddly people. And this is a pagan gathering at Stonehenge, I imagine, probably on the solstice or the equinox, because a lot of people gather at Stonehenge on the solstice or the equinox for their ceremonies. And they're nice people, and you know, they're not Nazis. So there's no cause and effect. Just because you're interested in paganism doesn't mean that you're going to become a Nazi. But on the other hand, what we need to remember is that nature abhors a vacuum. Many people come along and say, the world is corrupt and I'm going to clean it up. You've got all these people doing bad things. I'm going to get rid of the people. I'm going to get rid of the bad things. I'm going to make the world a better place, a cleaner place. I'm going to drain the swamp, and I'm going to make the world pure and better. And you should be very wary of people like that. People who say that they're going to get rid of the bad past and they're going to introduce a glorious future. Because history shows that when you try to get rid of everything bad in the past, people who say that, once they get power, kill a lot of people. And if you say everybody now is believing bad things and I'm going to introduce new good beliefs, be very careful of that. Because at times when old beliefs die and new beliefs are introduced, that often means killing a lot of people.